You're the one who gave him breakfast every morning, aren't you? The officer's voice broke the silence, part command, part tremor. Outside, 4 black military SUVs came to a synchronized stop in front of the small bakery. The engines shut off at the same moment, and everything went still. The young baker froze, her hands still dusted with flour. Her eyes darted toward the window, where rows of soldiers stood at attention, their formation so precise it sent a chill through the air. He left you a letter, before he passed away. No one spoke another word. The air grew dense with the scent of warm bread and the quiet tension of held breath. The only sound she heard was the soft click of the door latch, just before her world changed forever. A humble baker, an old forgotten soldier, and a promise the United States Army never forgot. If you believe that true courage isn't found in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence of those who have lived through war, subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories and help us preserve the memory, dignity, and reverence for the quiet heroes among us. The small room behind the bakery counter still carried the faint scent of coffee and burnt flour. Marisol sat motionless after the door closed. Outside, the sound of 4 SUV engines slowly faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence so complete it seemed to hum. She lowered her gaze, her flour-dusted hands trembling, as she stared at the thick white envelope quivering between her fingers. Morning light slipped through the glass, tracing a thin golden line along the edge of the wooden table. The world seemed to hold its breath with her. A soft draft slipped through the doorframe, stirring the curtain and sending a receipt fluttering to the floor. Marisol didn't pick it up, she only watched. Her heartbeat slowed as if afraid that the slightest movement might shatter the stillness that filled the room. She drew a deep breath and set the envelope on the table. The ink of the Department of the Army seal had slightly smudged, but the emblem itself remained sharp. Her fingertips brushed the edge of the paper, cold and sharp as a blade cutting through memory. And suddenly, he was there again, in her mind, the old man with the stooped shoulders, the faded baseball cap, the quiet, steady eyes. Every morning he had sat on that bench as though it were the only place left in the world where he could rest. Marisol whispered to no one, almost to herself, "Who were you?" Really, the question dissolved into the air. No answer came, only the ticking of the clock behind the counter. Her hands shook as she opened the letter. Inside was a piece of paper covered in handwriting that slanted to the right, firm, uneven lines written by someone who had known hardship. Her voice trembled as she read aloud, "To the woman who gave me breakfast. You don't know who I am, and I never meant to tell you. But every morning when I saw that paper bag, I remembered that good people still exist. I was once a sergeant in the Special Forces, lost my son in an operation no one remembers anymore. I left. I meant to disappear. But you reminded me that kindness is its own kind of battle." Marisol stopped reading. Her eyes burned red. The final lines were blurred by what could only have been tears. Beneath them, a single sentence stood alone. "Tell my son's brothers, I remember them." A heavy breath escaped her lips, followed by a silence so deep it seemed to echo. She closed the letter gently, her hand resting on it, as if afraid to crease the words. She didn't know what insignia he once wore, what unit he had belonged to, only that he had been part of something far greater than himself. Outside, the light shifted from gold to pale white. The wind grew stronger, rattling the small bell against the doorframe. Marisol stood and walked slowly toward the counter. Each step carried a weight she couldn't name. She placed the letter in a small wooden frame beside an old photograph of her mother. The woman who had taught her to bake with heart, not just with recipes. 2 women, 2 generations bound by one belief that compassion still mattered even when no one was watching. Marisol opened the oven. The flames flared, glowing red and alive, reflecting off the glass in front of her. She shaped the first loaf of the day, her hands trembling more than usual. Every fold of the dough felt like a farewell, a quiet thank you to a soldier whose real name she would never know. Outside, a light rain began to fall. Droplets clung to the window frame, merging with the warm steam that filled the bakery, forming a thin veil of mist. Marisol looked out through it at the empty bench, still wet from the rain. No figure sat there now, only the absence itself, the emptiness that had become a symbol of memory. On the table, she placed a new brown paper bag. Inside was a warm loaf of bread, a neatly folded napkin, and a small handwritten note. Bread for those who still serve in silence. She didn't know who might come to take it, or if anyone would. But that no longer mattered. Some things she thought only need to be given. That alone is enough. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant hum of engines. A faint car horn echoed across the street, the first note of something drawing near, a quiet movement of fate preparing to break the stillness. That afternoon, the sky over Santa Isabel was the color of lead. The rain from the night before still lingered on the windows, streaking the glass with silver traces that caught the pale morning light. Marisol stepped out of her bakery, a cup of cold coffee in hand. On the stone bench by the door hung a new sign she had placed that morning: bread for those who need it. No questions, no shame. The damp air made the metal letters shimmer faintly, yet not everyone smiled when they saw it. Across the street, a few regulars stood outside the cafe, their voices carried through the dry wind. "She's still leaving bread out there," one man said. "That old guy's dead, isn't he?" A middle-aged man smirked. "Maybe she just wants to get on the news again." The laughter that followed was soft but sharp, slicing through the quiet rhythm of the small town. Marisol heard every word but said nothing. She set her cup down on the railing and looked toward the distant hill where not long ago soldiers had stood at attention to honor her. A young employee tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Marisol," he whispered, "I think someone's filming you." She turned. A girl she'd never seen before was holding up a phone. Its lens pointed at the empty bench and the fresh loaf resting on it. The girl's eyes held no malice, only curiosity. "Who's the bread for?" she asked. Marisol smiled gently, her voice barely louder than the wind. "For whoever needs it more than I do." The clip was barely 20 seconds long. That night, it appeared online with a simple caption: "A woman keeps leaving bread for a soldier who never returned." No one expected what came next. By morning, it had spread across the country. Hundreds of comments poured in. "She reminds me of my mother during deployment. That's what honor looks like." "Semper Fi, ma'am." Then a single account marked by an eagle and a blue star left one brief comment: "We know who she is, and we remember him." The next morning, the bakery doorbell rang differently, longer, deeper, almost ceremonial. A young man in a Navy uniform stepped inside. He removed his cap and nodded. "Ma'am, I'm Petty Officer William Torres, son of Sergeant Mateo Torres." Marisol froze. "Mateo, he was your father." "Yes, ma'am," the sailor replied softly. "I saw the video. Everyone at our base did. You did something none of us could do for my grandfather." The room seemed to thicken with silence. Even the customers at the tables stopped moving. "My grandfather used to say," the young man continued, his voice calm but firm, "if one day I disappear, don't look for me. Look for the person who still believes in kindness." You did that. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small black velvet box. Inside lay a silver insignia engraved with the words "United States Army Special Forces, de Oppresso Liber." The sunlight from the window struck it, scattering a cold metallic gleam across the counter. Marisol's fingers trembled as she touched it. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "No, ma'am," the young man said, his voice thickening with emotion. "You deserve it more than anyone. You didn't just give him bread, you gave him back his faith." The words cut through the heavy air, dissolving the weight of mockery that had once surrounded her. The people who had laughed before now stood pressed against the windows, silent. They saw the emblem gleaming in the baker's hands, and finally understood that some things needed no defense. An elderly man in the corner murmured, "That's the Special Forces insignia. No one wears that unless they've been through hell." Marisol bowed her head, tears falling though her face remained composed. "I only bake bread, sir." The young sailor smiled a quiet, proud smile. "And sometimes," he said, "one loaf of bread is enough to save a soul." The bakery door opened again. Sunlight spilled across the sign outside. A gentle wind swept through, lifting the linen covering the tray before letting it fall softly over the silver emblem, like a farewell salute. From afar came the low hum of military engines, not loud, not boastful, but steady, like a promise approaching on the wind. In that moment, Santa Isabel seemed to stop breathing. Every eye turned toward the woman in the red apron where quiet strength had changed direction. No longer the pity of a town, but the reverence of a nation. Power had left the noise and returned to the truth. In the distance, the engines grew clearer, each rotation pulsing like the heartbeat of the earth. Someone in the crowd whispered, voice trembling, "They're here." Everyone turned toward the sound. Down the gravel road, a line of military vehicles advanced in perfect formation. Their deep green paint caught the sunlight, flanked by flags rippling in the wind. No one spoke, only the synchronized rhythm of boots striking the ground, and the low hum of engines remained a sacred cadence Santa Isabel had not heard in years. That afternoon, the sun over Santa Isabel hung low, pouring an old bronze glow across the still rooftops. In front of the bakery, The wooden bench remained in its place, and on it sat a familiar paper bag, a freshly baked loaf, still warm, steam gently rising. No one sat there anymore. Yet people continued to talk about it, in voices that varied between mockery, indifference, and quiet disdain. A regular customer, a middle-aged man who often dropped by, cast a glance at the bench and shook his head. "You're still doing that, Marisol?" "The man's dead. Who's going to eat those loaves you keep leaving out there?" She didn't respond, only wiped her hands on her apron. The man smirked, raising his voice just enough for others to hear. "She's performing, that's all. Wants people to feel sorry for her. No real soldier ever needed pity from a baker." The mood in the shop dropped heavy. The other customers fell silent. Only the steady rhythm of a bread knife cutting through crust broke the air. Marisol said nothing, but her shoulders trembled slightly. Light from the window touched her face, tracing the sweat along her temple. Inside her, something broke quietly, completely. A young apprentice stepped forward, gripping his phone tightly. "You should take that back," he said. The man raised a brow. "And who are you, kid, a hero?" The boy answered calmly. "But I know who that old man really was." The man scoffed, ready to respond, but the boy placed his phone on the counter and hit play. Soft music filled the room, followed by a video, an elderly man with silver hair, sitting upright, eyes fixed on the distance, holding a worn fabric cap in his hand. At the top of the screen, faded letters appeared: Ignacio Torres, U.S. Army Special Forces, 1973 to 1995. The bakery fell completely silent. Only the faint wind brushed past the doorway, making the little bell tremble. The man's face paled, his eyes darted uncertain. He was real," he muttered. "Yes," the boy said. "And she was the only one in this town who treated him like a person." The news spread like dry wind across the desert. The 20-second clip was posted online, and within hours it had been shared by hundreds of veterans, soldiers, and families who had lost someone far away. Under the video, comments began to appear one after another. "He trained my unit. I owe that man my life. Thank you for seeing him when no one else did." The next day, the wall outside the bakery was covered with small notes, old dog tags, and faded photographs. People came quietly, placing their hands on the sign that read, "Bread for those who need it." No one spoke aloud, but each gesture felt like a salute. The following morning, when Marisol opened the door, she found a new envelope neatly placed at her feet. Printed across the top in bold black letters, "Department of Defense, Special Operations Command." Inside was a single sheet of paper. We saw the video, and we remember him. That soldier once served with the U.S. Army Special Forces. From this day forward, Santa Isabel Bakery will be recognized under the Honor Outreach Program. Thank you for doing what this nation should have done long ago. Marisol bowed her head, clutching the paper in both hands. The tears that fell were not of sorrow, but of understanding. She was no longer alone. Outside, the man who had mocked her earlier stood still by the window. His eyes softened. His voice cracked as he said, "I'm sorry, Miss Rivera. I didn't know." Marisol didn't turn around. Her voice was barely a whisper. We rarely know who's still fighting, until they stop breathing. No one spoke after that. Only the soft jingle of the doorbell and the scent of fresh bread filled the warm air. Power had left the noise and returned to the truth. Later that afternoon, at the end of the dusty road, the first sounds of military engines rose once more. Not loud, not hurried, just steady, deliberate, carrying a weight everyone could feel. The scent of fuel and iron mingled with the desert wind, forming a rhythm that felt solemn, almost sacred. From the horizon, uniforms began to appear, rows of soldiers in perfect formation, marching through the golden haze of the setting sun. No one spoke a word, but every person watching knew what was coming. Down that road was not just a convoy of soldiers. It was the return of honor, of memory, and of reverence for a man the world had almost forgotten. That morning, Santa Isabel seemed to hold its breath. The first light of day stretched across the damp gravel road, casting long shadows beneath fluttering flags. In front of the small bakery, a few townspeople gathered quietly, drawn by a sense that something sacred was approaching. No one spoke. Only the wind whispered through the flagpoles, and the deep, steady hum of engines echoed from afar, measured, slow, solemn, like the footsteps of history itself. 4 black military SUVs rolled in tires, crunching the gravel in rhythm. Behind them came a truck carrying a folded American flag sealed in a glass case, followed by a group of soldiers in dark ceremonial uniforms. They halted before the bakery, their formation flawless, no unnecessary word, no wasted movement. From the first SUV, a man stepped out. His hair was graying, his shoulders draped with shining silver insignia that caught the morning sun. He needed no introduction. The authority in his bearing said everything. His voice carried low, steady, and filled with quiet gravity. I am Colonel David Santos, United States Army. I'm here today to fulfill the promise of a soldier who's gone. The bakery fell silent. Marisol stood behind the counter, her hands instinctively brushing flour from her apron, her eyes trembling. The colonel approached, holding an old envelope whose edges had frayed from years of care. He placed it gently on the counter and gave a respectful nod. The man you used to give bread to each morning wasn't a drifter, Miss Rivera. He was Sergeant Ignacio Torres, U.S. Army Special Forces, a man who led more than 20 missions in the Middle East, and the father of Sergeant Mateo Torres, who gave his life rescuing his unit in 2022. No one breathed. Time seemed to stop. The ticking clock above the register vanished into silence. Marisol could only stare at the envelope, her lips trembling, but voiceless. The colonel continued, his tone softening. After his son's death, he never returned to base. He walked away, choosing silence over sympathy. But then he met you. In his final letter to me, he wrote, "She reminded me that the world still has good people. She made me believe my son didn't die for nothing." A young soldier accompanying the colonel stepped forward, carrying a wooden box draped with the American flag. The colonel opened it slowly. Inside lay a silver star, aged, its edge dulled yet gleaming brightly when the sunlight filtered through the window. Holding it with both hands, he said deliberately, "Sergeant Ignacio Torres was nominated for the Silver Star for saving 6 men during a mission no one else dared return to. He refused the medal, saying, 'Honor isn't for the ones who survive, it's for those who keep their humanity.'" Turning toward Marisol, the colonel's voice deepened. "And today, on behalf of the United States Army, I present this medal not only in memory of him, but in gratitude to you. You helped a soldier find his faith again in the final days of his life." The room erupted into silence, a silence more powerful than applause. Outside, the soldiers stood at rigid attention, saluting in perfect unison. The flag atop the truck fluttered gently in the wind, its colors mirrored in the silver gleam across the pavement. Marisol's hands shook as she accepted the medal. Tears streamed down her cheeks, yet she smiled through them. "I only did what my mother once taught me, that no one becomes poorer by sharing a loaf of bread." The colonel bowed his head, his voice filled with reverence. "No, ma'am. You did far more than that. You reminded us that compassion is also part of this uniform." One soldier from the honor guard lifted the flag from its case, holding it across his chest. Everyone bowed their heads as the trumpet began to play, low, slow, mournful, echoing across the quiet street. In the pale morning light, the flag was raised before the small bakery, where once stood an old bench and a nameless paper bag. From afar, the townspeople of Santa Isabel stood still. Many placed their hands over their hearts. Others simply wept. No one needed to speak. Each understood that this silence was no longer emptiness. It was remembrance. Colonel Santos rendered one final salute, then turned to Marisol. His words came soft like the wind. "His name will be restored to our memorial rolls. But to us, he never truly left." Marisol bowed her head, the silver star clutched tightly in her hand. Outside, the sunlight caught the metal scattering light across the wall, like the blessing of a soul at peace. Recognition never arrives with noise. It comes like a ceremony measured sacred and still. In that moment, Santa Isabel, the quiet town the world had forgotten, became the place where honor was reborn. The next morning, the flag still waved in the wind above the bakery. A military jeep rolled slowly into the square. The door opened, and a young officer stepped out. Uniform pressed face, solemn yet kind. In his hands, he carried a thick folder and an old faded photograph. He approached Marisol and spoke in a low, steady tone. "I've been sent to bring back the story of Sergeant Ignacio Torres, so that everyone in our unit remembers the woman who reminded us of what truly matters, compassion." No one replied. Sunlight passed through the flag, casting its shadow across his face. And in that silence, everyone knew what was about to be told wasn't just a story. It was the return of truth, of honor, and of courage that had once stood beneath the same flag. The moment the jeep engine fell silent, the square of Santa Isabel sank into a reverent stillness unlike anything the town had ever known. The sky was a pure, solemn blue. Sunlight glinted off the polished badges across the soldiers' chests. Standing at the center of the crowd, Colonel Santos was beside Marisol, his voice deep and deliberate, as if each word was laid upon the foundation of memory itself. 30 years ago, he began on the southern border of Iraq. There was a small special forces unit called Echo 12. It consisted of 5 soldiers assigned to rescue a reconnaissance team trapped behind enemy lines. Among them was a man named Ignacio Torres. No one moved. Only the American flag rustled softly in the wind. The colonel unfolded a weathered map, its corners frayed and yellowed with time. He spread it across a makeshift wooden table and placed his finger on a small red-marked zone. That operation was recorded as Operation Silver Veil. The unit lost radio contact in the middle of a sandstorm. When the helicopters finally arrived, all they saw were flames in the distance. What they didn't know was that one man had stayed behind, pulling his teammates out from the wreckage one by one. His voice wavered slightly. That man was Sergeant Torres. He refused to board the helicopter, saying, "There's still one more down there." When the rescue team returned the next morning, they found him lying over a wounded soldier, both still alive. He refused the Medal of Valor, saying only, "They deserve it, not me." The quiet murmur among the crowd faded away, replaced by bowed heads and the whisper of wind. A young soldier whispered from the ranks, "De oppresso liber," to free the oppressed. Those words were never truer than with him. The colonel looked toward the bakery's sign, the one that read, "Bread for those who need it," fluttering faintly in the breeze. His voice grew softer. Sergeant Torres survived, but he never escaped the loss of his son. When Sergeant Mateo Torres was killed in Syria while protecting his team, the old man fell silent. He never returned to base, never asked for support, never complained. In his final report, he wrote only one line, "Honor doesn't die, it just goes quiet." Marisol stood frozen, her eyes glistening. "I never knew," she whispered. The colonel nodded gently. "No one did. Not until he met you." In his final letter, he wrote, "That girl reminded me that kindness still exists. She made an old soldier believe that compassion can also be a form of courage." A single trumpet sounded. The military band stepped forward and formed a line across the square. The brass tones rose deep and haunting, echoing through the narrow streets. The melody of taps, the farewell played for fallen soldiers, drifted through the air, slow and heavy with feeling. As the music played, every soldier in the formation raised a salute in perfect synchrony. The American flag climbed skyward, half sun, half wind, a scene both grand and tender. An elderly veteran stepped forward, pulling a worn medal from his pocket and placing it beside the silver star. "He saved my life," the man said softly. "We used to call him Quiet Hawk, the Silent Hawk." A young female officer added, "And now the world will know he never disappeared. He's just been flying lower, closer to the ground, to protect people like you." Marisol bowed her head. Tears fell onto the medals, glimmering like glass under the light. Her voice quivered but held steady. "Thank you not for what he did, but for believing that even a small loaf of bread could save a soldier's faith." Colonel Santos met her eyes, his expression both stern and kind. "And thank you," he said, "for reminding us that honor doesn't need a battlefield to survive." The music faded. The last trumpet note lingered in the air, like the echo of a soul still on its way home. A soft wind passed through the square, carrying the scent of fresh bread, the fragrance of life itself, something Ignacio Torres had protected until his final breath. Marisol stepped out to the doorway, lifting her gaze toward the flag above. In that moment, she understood that her small bakery was no longer just a place that sold bread. It had become a living memorial, a space where memory and honor met in silence. As the soldiers departed, the square slowly settled back into peace beneath the late afternoon sun. The breeze carried dust and the faint flutter of the flag overhead. Out of the quiet crowd, a small boy stepped forward, his wide eyes fixed on the sign, "Bread for those who need it." He tugged at Marisol's sleeve and asked in a voice as soft as the wind, "Ma'am." Was he a hero? Marisol knelt down, a gentle smile lingering on her tear-streaked face. "No, sweetheart," she whispered. "He was just a man who kept his promise." The boy nodded, his young eyes shining with understanding. He turned to look at the flag waving above them. And in that moment, it seemed as though kindness had found its path from an old soldier through the hands of a humble baker into the heart of a child. Kindness needs no applause, only to be passed on quietly, eternally. That afternoon, sunlight slanted through the bakery window, spreading a soft golden hue across the framed photographs, the medals and the letter of Sergeant Torres hanging on the wall. There were no more engines, no more ceremonial trumpets. Only the smallest sounds of the world remained: the soft tap of a knife on wood, the quiet rhythm of breath, and the gentle sweetness of bread filling the air. Marisol sat behind the counter. In front of her sat Colonel Santos and two young soldiers who had just returned from base. On the table lay the silver star resting beside a freshly baked loaf, whose golden crust caught the light. The colonel spoke first, his voice deep and measured, as though each word carried the weight of respect. "We've read everything he wrote, Miss Rivera." In his final letter, he didn't ask to be remembered, nor did he ask for recognition. He simply said, "If anyone ever asks, tell them I was just a man who did what needed to be done." Marisol stayed quiet for a moment, lifting her eyes toward the flag still waving outside. And sometimes she said softly, "Doing what's right is just sharing breakfast." The younger soldier, the son of one of Torres's old comrades, bowed his head, his voice trembling slightly. "My father once told me about a man like him, a man who believed kindness was the second half of duty. I think today we finally understand what he meant." Marisol smiled faintly, not with pride, not from emotion, but with the quiet relief of someone who had carried a heavy truth for a long time. "You know," she said, "I used to be angry at those who mocked him, at those who never understood. But now I see. Forgiveness is the only way to keep his memory alive. He forgave a world that had forgotten him, and I'm just trying to do the same." The colonel nodded, his eyes softening. "Forgiveness," he said, "is the hardest thing, even for those who've faced war. Perhaps because it requires a kind of courage no one can see." Marisol's voice was barely a whisper. "Courage isn't stepping into fire. It's standing still in silence, and still believing the world can be good." A translucent calm settled over the room, like a veil of peace. The young soldier looked around, then spoke quietly, almost reverently. "We'll tell his story, not to glorify him, but to remind those who come after us that sometimes kindness is greater than any medal." Marisol rose and walked to the window. Outside, a few children were playing near the old bench. One of them paused, glanced up at the sign reading "Bread for those who need it," and smiled. She watched for a long while before turning back to them. "My generation witnessed war. Yours has known loss. But theirs," she said gently, "they'll witness kindness. And maybe that's what men like Sergeant Torres always hoped to see." The colonel said nothing. He simply brought his hand to his chest and saluted toward the flag. The young soldier followed, and in that shared silence, Marisol bowed her head too. She didn't wear a uniform, but in that moment, everyone understood she was serving her own mission, the mission of compassion. The last light of day shone through the window, casting the shadows of the flag and the medal across the table. Two symbols, honor and kindness, merged into one like the final message of a soldier long gone. No one becomes poorer by sharing bread, and no one is ever alone while they are remembered. The colonel turned toward the door, his voice low but firm. He left in silence, but today it's that silence that allows us to hear what truly matters. Marisol watched him go, her smile blending into the fading sunlight. Sometimes she murmured, "Silence is just how the brave keep speaking." The room fell quiet again. Nothing more needed to be said. Only the soft wind passing the bench outside, and the scent of warm bread weaving through the last rays of sunlight, like a thank you left unspoken but deeply felt. That night, as the bakery lights dimmed, townsfolk walking past noticed a new wooden sign hanging beneath the old one. It bore only one line: "In memory of those who taught us how to live with kindness." Marisol stepped back and looked at it, her eyes reflecting the silver glow of the moon. It wasn't the end of a story, it was the beginning of a legacy. A place where kindness would continue to live passed quietly from one heart to the next, carried forward by those who remember. A year later, Santa Isabel was no longer the same. The quiet desert town had become a destination, a place where convoys of soldiers stopped to rest, where gray-haired veterans gathered to remember, and where young cadets in crisp uniforms, their fabric still unwrinkled, came to learn what honor truly meant. In front of the bakery, where once there had been nothing but an old wooden bench, stood a small bronze memorial plaque. Etched upon it were the words, "Sergeant Ignacio Torres, U.S. Army Special Forces. He taught us that compassion is also a part of honor." Each morning, as the first light of the sun touched the plaque, the bronze glowed with a soft, golden warmth, casting its reflection on the bakery window, where the American flag still fluttered in the wind. Inside, Marisol continued her quiet ritual. She still woke before dawn, kneaded dough, and opened the oven. But each time she placed a loaf on the tray, she whispered, "For those who still serve, even in silence." The visitors who came were no longer just townsfolk. Some drove from distant bases, Texas, Arizona, even as far as the Carolinas. They didn't come for the pastries. They came to see the place where an ordinary woman had safeguarded the faith of a forgotten soldier. Many bowed their heads before the plaque. Some touched the engraved letters, lips moving in silent prayer. One warm afternoon in May, a group of cadets from a military academy stopped by. They were young, their dark blue uniforms immaculate, their new leather boots still creaking with every step. The instructor pointed toward a sign on the plaque and said, "This is where a sergeant chose silence over glory, and where a woman reminded a nation who he was." A student hesitated, then asked softly, "Sir, why didn't he accept his medal?" The instructor smiled. "Because some medals aren't meant to be worn on the chest, only carried in the heart." The murmur of voices faded, leaving only the sound of the wind threading through the flags that lined the street. Behind the counter, Marisol stood quietly listening. Her eyes shone with pride, but beneath it lingered a gentle ache. She knew that though Ignacio was gone, his legacy lived on in these young men, in every bowed head, in every loaf of bread, given without a name or question. That evening, as the sun softened over the horizon, a small convoy stopped in front of the bakery. They were the veterans of Echo 12. One of them, his back slightly bent, his hair silver, stepped forward, carrying a small wooden box. He opened it carefully. Inside lay a replica of the Silver Star once awarded to Torres. Placing it beneath the plaque, he said in a trembling voice, "We didn't come to say goodbye. We came to say, we're still here." Marisol said nothing. She simply placed beside the medal a fresh loaf of bread steam, still rising from its crust. That image, the medal and the loaf side by side beneath the amber light, was almost too simple, too pure. A symbol of courage and a symbol of kindness together forming something war had never been able to destroy humanity. The sky above Santa Isabel turned violet. The flag rippled gently in the desert breeze, reflecting the last glimmers of sunlight. A little girl from the town ran up clutching a small piece of paper. In the quiet evening air, she read aloud, "Bread for those who need it. No questions. No shame." Everyone turned toward her and smiled. In their eyes was something that had been renewed, something light as breath, enduring as memory. When night came, the street fell dark except for the warm glow of the memorial plaque. Its light spilled across the bakery wall, where the shadows of the flag, the medal, and the loaf merged into three symbols of a simple yet profound story. Inside, Marisol sat at her counter and wrote a few lines in her notebook. "If one day someone asks me about courage, I will tell them about an old soldier with a worn cap, and how he made the world remember that kindness still exists." She closed the book, smiling softly, then looked out the window, where the wind carried the scent of fresh bread mingling with the quiet air of freedom and memory. Outside, the flag continued to wave like the greeting of souls who had never truly left. And in that stillness, the deep voice of Colonel Santos seemed to echo from afar. Courage doesn't need a battlefield, only a heart that remembers. Brave veteran stories. We remember the quiet heroes,